Welcome to Post-Doom, regenerative conversations exploring overshoot grief, grounding, and gratitude. I'm Michael Dowd, your host, and in this conversation, recorded in early August of 2020, I speak with Erik Assadourian. Erik is the force behind Gaianism.org. In fact, I encourage you to check out Gaianism.org, and it's a philosophical path through an ecologically unstable time. And you'll see that Erik and I share a profound love of life, of Gaia, of ecology as what I call the heart of theology. And he also, because he's a young father, he has some rituals and things like that on the website. And I now consider him one of my closest colleagues in this earth-honoring faith. So, enjoy.
First, it's great to join you, Michael. I know we've chatted a few times just informally, but I've actually since then been watching some of your other conversations, and such a rich, treasure trove of information and ideas, and individuals that I've gotten to know a little bit or gotten to hear a little bit. So it's been nice to really dig into that. As for me, so I think my perspective has been formed really through 17 years at World Watch, which I can go into more later, but I have studied sustainability and the biggest questions, which I'm blessed to have had that kind of freedom, but just to look at what is sustainability, and is it possible anymore, and how do we get there if so, and what do we do if we can't? And so most of what I've been writing about since the beginning, actually since I kind of broke through the kind of the early stages of being a researcher there, where I was doing more concrete work. That's what I was doing. And as I was there, more and more, I saw Arne Naess's critique of shallow ecology as legitimate and central to this conversation. And people like Martin Palmer, who say, environmentalism keeps the guilt and the fear and the anxiety from, religion, and strips out all the joy and the happiness in the community and all that. And that's kind of really brought me around to Gaianism, or the Gaian way, or it's a work in progress. I've been thinking about it since probably 2008, 9, and only really opened myself to sharing it publicly probably in the last year and a half. But so I think there's a lot of vocabulary that is still being formed. But ultimately, it's really about building a community of ecocentric individuals, Gaians, who recognize that their ultimate purpose, especially now on a wounded planet, is to bring healing to that planet and to ourselves and to our communities. But that's not just a political process like environmentalism has become, but an opportunity to connect with other people around a spirituality, build community, help pull others who might be, living the consumer way, which isn't very deeply spiritually gratifying or meaning-making, and bring them into this community, which then can actually bring more energy to this and actually expand our healing further.
Yeah. Share your journey and any mile posts along the way in terms of how you came to this current understanding.
So I will put the child rearing aside for a minute, just because the background is a little bit circuitous, and I'm surprised I'm here, frankly. Right? So when I was a kid, I was a very good consumer. I remember drinking soda and consuming all the things I'm supposed to consume, Lucky Charms and Fruity Pebbles, and from breakfast on to dinner time and beyond, eating the garbage consumer diet. And I think it was actually my summer job in high school that really woke me up and shut me down all at the same time, giving me like a post-doom early glimpse, right? I was a furniture mover. So I was literally moving 10 to 20,000 pounds of people's crap in a day, right? With 3 or 4 other people, wrapping it in plastic just to throw that plastic away when it arrived. Using 50-pound sacks of paper to wrap their stuff, which again just went right in the garbage, and on and on. And I was kind of environmentally leaning at that moment, and that shut me down completely. I said, this is hopeless. I was a little 16-year-old. I didn't know anything about the world. I already decided it was all hopeless.
How old are you
And just
now?
kind of, I'm 43.
Okay, great.
Yeah. But so kind of turned off completely. Instead, kind of pursued a very academic story about, why are we religious? Why do we believe in God? I studied psychology and religion in college, and that just gave me, by luck, an opportunity to go to India with a moral psychology professor who, wanted to go back to his home, Bangalore. He was a British Indian, and we went there on a junket. I would say, the research was the idea. We were going to study Kohlberg's moral universalism versus Carol Gilbert's kind of relativism. And we did lots of school interviews. But what I took from that was the shock of the unsustainability of the spread of the consumer culture. I mean, everything from all the surfaces painted with Pepsi ads and Coke ads to the transformation of a somewhat sustainable street food system where people ate on banana leaves, and the cows and the oxen produced waste that fueled the stoves, to a foil and styrofoam based system where they were burning that in open pits on the side of the road. And it shocked me deeply, right? I mean, the anthropology professors warned me of reverse culture shock, and I came back completely devastated, going into grocery stores and couldn't buy anything, and was disgusted with how I was living and how we were living and all of that. And so I was perfectly ripe to be organized, right? So the Green Corps organizers came up to campus when I was at Dartmouth College, and the executive director went there, and she came up and she said, and Green Corps is a field school for environmental organizing. And the director came up there and said, we know what to do. We just need more people to do it. And so I was fully on board. And I went, and they taught me the skills of organizing, and but they also it was classic environmentalism, where it was about getting names, getting donations, building the semblance of power rather than the long-term goals of building community that could then be powerful. I mean, even in the way we were taught to canvas. I remember, being so proud. I got my first donation going up to a door, and my supervisor said, so how did that go? And I was like, it's great. We mobilized her. She wants to get involved. We got a donation. And she's like, yeah, but you spent too much time there. We have a lot of doors to do, right? And so that kind of demoralized me right there. And I also felt like I knew nothing about sustainability or the environment. I didn't study that. Yeah. So I actually went to World Watch a year later as an intern. Actually joined a project on the religious community's role in sustainable development. Because of my background, it kind of pulled me in, and then stayed there until World Watch wound down in 2017. And those years, I mean, I stayed so long, I think, because I was given that freedom to keep ratcheting up the ideas, saying, okay, we have to rein in the consumer economy. But then that didn't feel strong enough, so I kind of moved on to, okay, we need to transform culture completely and get away from the paradigm of consumerism and build this paradigm of sustainability, and just kept kind of pushing beyond the comfort levels of even my World Watch colleagues, right? Wrote about economic degrowth the following year, which kind of polarized the board and the staff, and so it was a real opportunity to really kind of keep saying, well, yeah, this isn't going to do it. This isn't far enough. We got to keep going harder. And since World Watch had kind of a cachet around being mainstream-ish, but serious, to write something like economic degrowth is essential in overdeveloped countries, it put a lot of power behind the words that I said, rather than if I were at someplace
Exactly.
Like Greenpeace.
Continue on in terms of your own heart and mind evolution, in terms of getting the big picture. How how you see things now in a coronavirus era, and does that make any difference in terms of things that you've written? As I mentioned, I just read this morning a piece that you had written on education, looking back from 2030. So I'm just curious how your worldview and your understanding of what's possible and what's really not possible going forward. And I mean, you've got behind you moving towards sustainable prosperity.
I thought you'd like that.
State of the world. Something, yeah, exactly. And for many of us in this conversation series, 10 years ago, we really believed that was possible. And so tell us a little bit about that journey for you.
Yeah, I actually thought about switching the cover. I have two State of the World covers in the house. The other one is the next year, so 2013. Is sustainability still possible, right? Like, so just in the 2 years from 2012 to 2013, there was a massive mind shift.
Exactly.
But sustainable prosperity is in theory achievable. It just doesn't look anything like we're talking or we're used to. The consumer model of it.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to think that it is possible at a certain scale, but that at a larger scale, when you've got, the whole parable of the tribes thing, when you've got international power-based corporations and multinationals and oligarchs and, just the whole gamut, we're going to, in my world, one of the things that I've studied a lot in the last 7.5 years is the rise and fall of civilizations. And we have scores of examples of city-based, anthropocentric, human-centered civilizations with human-centered religion that's often gets co-opted. I want to come back to talking a little bit about religion with you. But none of them, there's not a single example that we have of them sort of in their declining years, their declining decades of their contraction collapse when they've gone into overshoot and are reaping the consequences of that, becoming sustainable. It just doesn't tend to happen at the systemic level. But I certainly agree that at small scale, at local, village, town, neighborhood, families, it's not only possible, but if our species survives this bottleneck, it's the only thing that's sustainable. It's the only thing that's genuinely sustainable.
I hope we'll talk bottlenecks at one point, because I think we are destined to go through one. We just have no choice at this point. But as far as education, so in 2012, my son was born. He's 8 now, and even before then, in the kind of culture changing work that I was doing at World Watch, I created a rubric of, okay, well, so if we recognize that culture is malleable, which is kind of the heart of it, right? Dana Meadows kind of pointed out the best way to change a system is to change the paradigm, change the culture. So then, okay, well, what are the societal institutions to change culture? It's education, business, government, traditions, media and marketing, and social movements, right? So, okay, we got all those. And so there was a whole section on education that I was thinking about, but it was in a abstract sense of it, right? I didn't have a son yet. But so then kind of having the opportunity in 2017, State of the World needed a theme, and I was really excited about education, obviously really expanding this question of what education has to look like. And even in those 7 years, it wasn't just about sustainability education anymore. It was education for sustainability and resilience, right? There is a very small literature on resilience education at this point. And if you actually Google that, you'll find psychological resilience, right? Which is not, which is a component of it. But I'm talking about, okay, if a collapse is really happening in my son's lifetime, or maybe my own, depending on if I make it through, there's really a whole set of skills that he's going to need, not just, how to mobilize people and organize around sustainability or kind of that kind of thing, but also just how to deal with conflict and yes. and basic wilderness skills, perhaps, and farming. We this summer, a lot of I homeschool him, and he, during the normal times, he was going on Tuesdays to a forest wilderness school where he'd spend 6 hours in the woods, no matter the weather. with, trained wilderness mentors and other kids, and he loves
That's
it.
awesome.
Yeah, and he gets some skills, and he was in the younger group until, this fall. If it starts again, he'll go in the older group, so he'll start learning knife skills and making fire and all that stuff. But even in the younger, group, it's about games. They gamify all this wilderness knowledge, and they're eating plants, and they're kind of stalking quietly, but it's all game, right? But he's gonna, those skills are essential in connecting him to Gaia, first
Amen.
of all. That's,
Amen.
but also just in having, basic understanding of nature and ecosystems. And if our systems do fall apart, not everybody's going to survive off of acorns, but having that knowledge on how to process acorns isn't going to hurt. If you can get some access to them, that might mean the difference between life and death. And the connections to the rest of it. Right now, I was going to say, right now we're going to a little CSA farm, and we're farming it for a couple hours a week, which is hard work. I didn't actually realize how much work it is, and I know I should know, but it's not like I do it all the time. But so it just him getting that experience, and we're wrapping tomato plants to make them stronger, and we're weeding and weeding and weeding, and taking care of cucumber plants. And so it's, all those skills, even if it leads him to want to, go into a different sector, but, he has it in his knowledge in case he ever needs it, or at least has respect for people who make that their livelihood by choice or by, necessity. So yeah, so I mean, for me, a lot of what I'm trying to do with my own son is just really put Earth at the center of his education.
Yes.
That doesn't mean we're not all about math and science and English and languages. Actually, I'm a little bit rambly today. I'm sorry, and interrupt me at any point, but I'll make one more point right now. When I was working on this, I asked a colleague, how do you make a child resilient for these tough times ahead? And he said one word. He said, and it wasn't plastics, it was languages. And he just, he was a German guy who worked with the Goethe Institute, so it's not surprising, right? Language is central in the European perspective, but it was a good reminder. And right now my son is learning 4 languages because he has a trilingual mother, and we added Spanish in there. And so, I mean, that's a skill set that is going to come in handy in any future, right? So language is essential anyway, but you can make a living out of translating. I kind of, with the Earth education state of the world, I borrowed Maslow's pyramid structure to kind of make that very, very clear, right? At the foundation of Earth education has to be that relationship with the Earth. And then stacked on top of that is social emotional learning, interrelationship skills. And then you can keep going above that, critical thinking and systems thinking, basic life skills. Yes. And then if you kind of bring it up all together, at the peak, which would be Maslow's kind of self-actualization, it would be, Earth-centric leadership.
Yes,
right?
exactly.
So that you need all those elements working together to really bring out a leader that can get us through both a transition to sustainability or the painful collapse, or maybe the collapse to sustainability, whatever scenario we kind of go through.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I wanted to comment on is your solar meditation and your attention to the importance of ritual and to meditation. I define meditation as paying attention at the speed of life. So there's lots of different ways to do that. But what it reminded me of when I was reviewing your website today is that I fell in love with Connie Barlow. Before I met her, she wrote a book called in 1997, she wrote a book called Green Space, Green Time, The Way of Science. And it's really the spirituality of science. It's a Gaian understanding. Her former partner is Tyler Volk, who's a Gaian scientist at New York University. And at any rate, she had a ritual, a Tiamat ritual at the end of her book, which was all about sort of, helping kids and teenagers have this like playful, like gamify the science. And I read this and I thought, who the hell is this woman? I just love her, is the bringing together of ecology, science, and ritual was just really yummy, So anyway, I just deeply resonated with anything that you do along those lines. I mean, your way of bringing together Gaian philosophy and the what I call practical spirituality, and sort of ecocentrism is just so profoundly aligned with what I think is important. Um,
Thank you.
yeah, yeah. The healthy and unhealthy aspects of religion in today's society. Just anything you want to say on the topic of religion.
Okay. Well, I want to say something about Goldsmith, actually. The way, it's interesting because I call it the Gaian way as well, and I'm inspired by his book, but also Christianity was originally called the way, right?
Yes.
And it's so simple, right? And it keeps being repeated over and over, right? Taoism obviously is the way, right? So it's communicating that there is a path that will bring you deeper meaning, that will bring you a community, that will bring you something more than what the day to day brings, right? For me, I mean, it's weird trying to create my own philosophy, right? I mean, it's not that unusual. Lots of people did it in ancient Greece, and Arnanas did it not so long ago, right? So I can kind of remind myself that I'm not being, very egotistical, or just wacko. But when I put that aside and just think, okay, how is this helping me? I mean, you mentioned the solar meditation, and I'm trying to integrate meditation much more deeply, as prayer was important when I was a Christian growing up, and as soon as I lost belief in the Christian God, I stopped praying, right? But there's so much evidence that shows that praying and meditation, which I feel like are very close siblings, is very deeply healing, right? And beneficial in all different ways. So why do we have to get rid of these practices just because we're secular environmentalists, right? So so a lot of this is me cultivating the different aspects of environmentalism that I wish existed, right? So there's a private practice of meditation, right? And I actually borrowed liberally from Islam in that case, right? 5 times a day seemed like a bar too high at this point. But 3 times a day, sunrise or whenever you wake up, noon and evening, or before bed or whatever, that makes sense, right? Those are the 3 moments of the day that kind of are transitional. We're not talking about a long process. 7 to 10 minutes is a decent meditation session if that's, if that makes it calming rather than stressful, right? If you're going to have to do 20 minutes and you freak out about it, well, let's not do it. And you can have so many different types of meditation. My son and I do karate, which, as I tell him over and over, that is not an extracurricular. That is fundamental in your training for what's coming.
Yes.
Where he is, it teaches respect, it teaches discipline, it teaches basic defense skills, which, there is a chance that those are necessary. But that is a very much of a form of meditation. I mean, we do Tai Chi-like meditations within the practice, but we also, do Zazen sitting, and just the movement of a kata is meditative. So for me, getting to this point, there's a meditation, there's a kind of a daily practice.
Take a minute or two and just describe the solar meditation so that people listening or watching this conversation have a sense of what it is you're referring to.
Sure. Yeah. Very briefly, I mean, for anyone who knows what Trataka is, this candlelight meditation where you're just kind of, focusing on a candle flame, either in your mind, once you've seen a candle enough, or a literal candle. And I like that meditation. It's simple, it's straightforward, but it's not ecological necessarily. I mean, it's fine. It's a perfectly good meditation. But then NASA just had released a 1 hour long, tracking a decade's worth of the sun, and at extreme UV radiation levels. So you can watch that, and it's like a candle flame, right? So that was the click where I was like, okay, we can really connect to the sun. We can do 11 breath cycles because that's the solar cycle is 11, right? So you can make it calming. You can really just focus on the sun, because the meditation for me is still not natural, right? So I do need some sort of thing to keep my mind from wandering, right? Whether that's a imaginary flame or sun or, the kind of, I call it digesting, which is my version of Tonglen, the Tibetan Buddhist one, where you're kind of breathing in, digesting, in a more natural way, and then exhaling, breathing in suffering and exhaling, like CO2, right? Or if a plant is breathing in CO2 and the side effect is oxygen for us to breathe, right? Can we breathe in suffering and let out health? And I don't believe it literally, right? I'm not, I'm a realist as well, in that sense. The idea though is, if prayer works, if all the data shows that meditation lowers blood pressure, improves concentration, does all these things, why wouldn't we be doing it? And why don't we find a system that embeds it more naturally so that we don't have to explain why we're doing it all the time, right? And then, so the last point of that is that, so you have this as a daily practice, but what I feel like is missing for me most deeply as an environmentalist is the equivalent of a Sunday service, right? That from the beginning has been my intention with Gaianism, right? Is to build local groups that can cultivate a local gathering. Even in the COVID era, it is an outdoor, forest meditation, right? So you can have a varying set of meditations. You can have the coffee or the sassafras tea hour afterwards. So you're building community, which is then organically leading to actions, right? It's one thing if I want to go down and do the protest and I have no one to go with. I don't have a community that's kind of putting pressure on me in a good way, saying, hey, you want to come with me to the protest? Let's make signs tomorrow and we'll go. That's why church is so powerful, right? You have that community that helps you live your best life and be your best self. And I don't think the environmental, sector, which is very professionalized, unfortunately, for the most part, it's not achieving that anymore. So that's kind of where I come from.
Right. Yeah. Another question that I've been asking my guests in this series is related to impermanence, death, mortality. And one of the things I read on your, I think it was actually cross-posted on Resilience, on sort of one of the hidden blessings, or one of the side effects. It's a positive thing about COVID-19 is it's making us more death aware. And that, that old spiritual advice of keeping your mortality as an advisor, to not take your life for granted. So anything you want to say about death, impermanence, and living now in a COVID-19 era?
Yeah, I mean, I think you summed it up to its bones. I think so many of us are kind of in that death denial stage. And so we don't want to think about it, but people literally thought about it every time they left their house, right? And that was, I think, helpful overall, right? I mean, when you have to actually say, do I really want to go to the grocery store? Do I really need coffee? Well, I'll take the risk. I'm doing it, right? So there's that kind of, shocker where we have insulated ourselves at every level from death, right? I mean, for me, I was in that camp. I mean, I remember avoiding, finding an excuse when I was in high school. I was in like the kind of the athletic camp before school started. And it was a good excuse not to go to my grandmother's funeral, right? And it was really because I was afraid of death, and I, didn't want to have negative feelings and all that stuff. It wasn't really until my dad died in 2005, and he died suddenly from a heart attack, that I was shocked awake into the horrors of our system that doesn't prepare us for death, that hides death. I mean, I went through the process with my mom of, because it was sudden, there was no preparation. So we just, got manipulated by the evil death industry. I don't use the word lightly, evil, but, they're pretty, I mean, ever since the 70s with the American way of death, they've been pretty effective at just milking people in their moment of suffering, saying, upscaling coffins, forcing you, telling you the rules are different than they really are. Oh no, you must embalm or whatever. So, we wasted a huge amount of resources on segregating my father permanently or for the next 500 years from Gaia, right? And it still pains me, right? The idea that he was embalmed and put in a fancy coffin in a plastic vault under pesticide-laden, grass in a modern cemetery. I'm working hard not to get upset as I'm talking.
Yes.
And I don't want that for anybody, right? I don't want us to believe that we want to be separate from nature when we die, right? I mean, I think the essay that I valued writing most for Gaianism was actually this other essay on death, more specifically, not COVID, where just there were two stories very similar, basically the same story, but with different metaphors. One is from Tuesdays with Maury, right? The wave that's rushing towards the shore and says, "Oh my gosh, this shore is coming," right? And the other wave says, "No, you're just part of the ocean. Stop freaking out," right? So death returns us to Gaia, right? And the other story was almost identical from a Buddhist monk saying, when the only time a river really differentiates itself from the river is in the waterfall, where the drops kind of separate out and you can see them, right? But you're still part of the river, and when it returns to the river, it's back, right? And the droplets shouldn't freak out either. And I think humans have to kind of accept that, right? There are lots of religions all trying to deal with the death in different ways, immortality, or nirvana, nothingness, right? So it's like, why are atheists so afraid of the nothingness when Buddhists are actually striving for breaking out of the wheel of reincarnation? But I think, for me, this process has really helped me clarify that we kind of have the best of both, right? So we return to something greater, right? In Hinduism, it would be Atman, right? But it's Gaia, right? Our life will go back into other plants, other animals, other creatures. We won't be conscious, right? And that's okay though, right? We don't need to reincarnate. We don't need to have immortal life, right? We just need to accept that we have a certain moment of time where we are conscious and differentiated from Gaia, and we can do great things with this life energy. And for me, great things above all, ultimate purpose is above all healing the earth, bringing us back into communion with this living planet and healing the mistakes that we've made, some unintentionally now, some intentionally, but we can really get us to a new positive relationship with the earth and with other creation. I like it.
So, Erik, I want to ask you about how have you processed, what tools have been helpful, or practices or exercises, dealing with depression, anger, frustration, grief, certainly grief, seeing what's happening to the world and being so committed as you've been for a long time to helping or trying to steer humanity in the right direction. How have you dealt with, and what has been supportive for you in the processing of the difficult emotions around all that?
It's an interesting question. I mean, and it's not coming as a surprise because I read the questions ahead of time, but it's still hard to answer. I mean, so there's the idealized versus the real, right? So I think many of us simply turn off the fear, right? Or maybe I'm lucky in that I kind of have that ability to kind of create just enough denial to keep functioning, but not enough to kind of disconnect, yes. Right? And so that's the real answer, I think. I mean, I certainly now, the meditation and kind of going through things, staying engaged, trying to push further than, colleagues' comfort levels and kind of go for what I think speaking truth, right? I mean, being honest about where we're heading. Um, but there's also just a level of saying, okay, I'm going to do as much as I can and not allow depression to consume me. I was reading an NPR article recently about Buddhist monks, women Buddhist monks, who really focus on training young women in self-defense, on disaster training, or disaster cleanup, on education, all these things. And then the story ended with, and on Sunday nights they watch horror movies. Right, and I'm like, that really? Okay, right? I wasn't expecting that, right? Because you have this romanticized version, image of Buddhist nuns who, are very pious, right? Just like a Christian monk or whatever. And the idea that they can just not take themselves seriously and enjoy Jaws or whatever movie they were. Halloween, I think they actually were talking about, which is not even a good movie. So I don't know how they pick. But so, I mean, I think there is a little bit of an escapism that, I think is a healthy amount of escapism, right?
Yeah, I call it adaptive inattention. It's like you're not in denial, but if I mean, there's lots of people that they're not in denial of climate change. They get it's severe, but they also get that we may already be into a runaway, abrupt climate change regime where there's nothing we can do about it. So you got to wake up each day having a good life, raising your kid, doing whatever you need to do. So it's adaptive inattention is the way I think about it. I don't think there's anything wrong with that.
Yeah, no. So I think that's nicely framed. And I mean, I certainly being just, homeschooling my son, a lot of energy is going there. So that kind of keeps me kind of invigorated and joyful. And we actually did as COVID was, well, before it started and as it raged, we did a kind of a marathon of Pandemic Legacy season 1 and 2, right? So there's this complex legacy game where you play, 12 months of fighting pandemics, right? And while, I was like, is this wrong to be doing during a pandemic? Is it going to scare my son rather than kind of be escapism? But it was highly useful in kind of putting safe boundaries around it and giving him the language to think and talk about pandemics. Before the pandemic actually started, we watched the Netflix pandemic documentary, which also, again, I mean, it gives him an ability to think through things and talk through things. And, so it's, storytelling has always been a way to kind of talk about difficult things in ways that make it safer. So there's some of that. But I also think, just keeping working, at World Watch, that was probably, just focusing on trying to communicate, trying to, spread an understanding and hope that would do the trick. Of course, I think we both agree that we're in for a rough ride, no matter how many people kind of come over to understanding. But now, especially with Gaianism, I mean, it's about building community. It's about the spiritual practice that I've neglected for, my academic years at World Watch. And it's been helpful. I mean, we have a monthly Gaian conversation online where, 12 to 15 of us sit down and talk about different issues, whether that's mortality once. We talked about what is Gaia, just because, we can't take that for granted that everyone agreed. And, and it was helpful. We talked about, is it a metaphor? Is it a vision? Is it a focus, right? Is it a living organism? But the big point that came through is, well, however we define it, the idea is that it is a focus to bring a community of action, of practice together that can actually do something good with their life energy.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting on your homepage, Gaianism.org, you've got right there at the start, with few years left before the rapid shift of Earth systems, it's time for a philosophy that can help people too. And then you got 4 things, A, B, C, D, and it's sort of a mix of things like, oh, absolutely, and a little idealistic. So I just want to read these and have you comment to whatever degree you want. So A, it's time for a philosophy that can help people to build a community of those who believe Gaia is sacred and that there is no higher calling than protecting and restoring Gaia. 100% right there. I mean, that's what it's all about. That's ecocentrism. Although I would personally remove the word believe. It's not about believing that Gaia is sacred. We have historical knowledge that only those cultures that treated Gaia as a greater thou to be honored and respected, rather than it to be a source of resources and waste, survive. So it's sort of pragmatic. It's not about beliefs. But B, provide ways to stop the horrors that we are unleashing on the planet, ourselves, and countless other species. When I read that, my first thought was, how's that going? It's like, those are nice words, but we're in such this global capitalist anthropocentric system is so ecocidal that yeah. So the third, offer means to prepare oneself, one's families, and one's communities for the difficult and possible terrible changes coming. Amen. Right there. And then D, find ways to draw others away from the earth-consuming dominant cultures and toward a Gaian culture. I align with that. However, I also have this pragmatic side of me that, trying to do that at scale, trying to do that in ways that, not just with certain individuals, but with thousands, millions of people, is pretty much impossible in a dominant culture where the media, social media, TV, what feeds people's minds is anything but that. So anyway, anything you want to say about Gaianism in general, but anything related to those?
Well, it's funny because I wrote those in the beginning, right? So when I started writing about, I think, June of last year, a weekly essay. I said, okay, this is probably the level that I can sustain without, either overcommitting and then it falling apart. And frankly, do people really want to read more than one essay a week? I mean, I'm so overwhelmed. There's so much good information out there. It's arrogant to think anybody has more time than one essay from me a week. So that was kind of the model that I stuck with. And before I started doing that, I was like, okay, I need a few basic pages. You're right. The second one, there is nothing there. I mean, right now, what can I show for this? Some essays that hopefully inspire some people to take on new practices. We have a kind of a monthly gathering plus more engagement individually, one-on-one at different times. Some are interested in starting their own local group. One is starting one. I'm starting one here in Middletown. It was a little delayed because of COVID, but it's kind of launching in September with forest meditation. So I think it's going to be safe.
Where do you live? I forget.
In Middletown, Connecticut.
Oh, right. Okay, great.
But so how does it scale? I don't know, right? But then again, I mean, one of the more inspiring books I've read is Rodney Stark's kind of early Christianity history, right? Where, if one of his theses was that Christianity thrived in periods of epidemics because the Christians stuck around and helped pagans, in the Roman sense, not neo-pagans, whose family and friends might have fled the city. Because they had means, these ones didn't. They were, the ones that survived, they might no longer have a social network, but the Christians were there. They also saw Christians in an exemplary light because they were saved, because they saved them. So Christianity kind of flourished in those times of disruption. So I think that is a model that, I don't want the disruption just so Gaianism can flourish, but I think the disruption is coming, frankly.
Absolutely.
That's not really up for debate. So can we provide a structure of, a community of practice where people are coming together, they're doing meditation, they're feeling good spiritually, they're also providing each other mutual aid, which was kind of an essential element of religion from the beginning, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, and the model for me for that was a very short-lived effort by the Institute for Policy Studies called Resilience Circles, right? Where they actually got people together, and the idea was, let's talk about what resources we have, what needs we have, and let's talk about how we can help each other, right? And the idea was that that would build some sort of community solidarity, resilience for when things start to fall apart. It didn't work. I don't know if that was because they just ran out of funding, because funders being, very project, they jump from project to project. They did find that the best successes with those circles were in already established churches, which was a major light for me again at that point, where it's like, okay, you really need a deeper, multifaceted community if you're going to do these other things, right? It's one thing to have a transition town, bringing people together specifically just to mobilize their communities to be more resilient, or that kind of thing. It's another if you're coming together each week to meditate, to connect, to hang out. There's the kids are coming because there's a forest Sunday school. So maybe the parents are only like half interested, but the kids love it. So they're coming and the community's growing, it's strengthening.
Exactly.
Suddenly that creates a little bit of momentum locally. I don't know if this can scale, if there's time. I mean, we have, in the modern
it's
era,
kind of a moot
Zoom,
point.
and we have kind of the internet to kind of facilitate. So there is some kind of perks right now that could allow it. But I also think, whether this specifically scales or other ecocentric kind of ideologies, I don't care.
Exactly.
Right? I'm not coming to this with ego. I'm coming to this with, we have to put Gaia at the center, and somehow if we don't, then we know what's going to happen.
Yes.
If we do, we still might have a chance at kind of thriving for a few more millennia or something like that, or after some dark times ahead.
Yeah. No, if the evidence of history, if the verdict of history is, of 2 million years of hominid existence since Homo habilis, 2.5 million years, if what has proven itself to be genuinely sustainable, not self-destructive, are forms of what we would call permaculture, regeneration, learning from the living world, working with the living world, preserving the living world as our first and foremost sacred responsibility, and then passing on the skills to our children and grandchildren for how to do that. And then, if that's the case, then it's not like we, at this point, this is my worldview, we don't have to try to stop industrialism from hitting the wall. It's going to hit the wall.
Sure.
But then the question is, can we plant enough seeds so that on the other side, those communities, those cultures, little C cultures and communities of practice and of heart and of relationship can then be an inspiration to others to, I consider it like the prodigal species. Like, we've squandered our inheritance. We're waking up to our predicament in the pig pen, as it were, and we're coming home to life as divine, to reality. Whether you use mythic language, God language, or more secular language. And so it doesn't matter whether it scales or not. I, of course, don't think it can scale, but that doesn't make it any less important, any less vital. It gives you life. It nourishes you and your family and others that are engaged in this process. It feeds your souls, and it plants seeds so that, as John Michael Greer says, when the rubble stops bouncing and new systems can emerge, hopefully some of them will be reflecting a Gaianism, ecocentric, life-centered perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. I know. I mean, when I was writing and transforming cultures, the kind of final point was about these cultural pioneers that could sow those seeds, right? And the pioneer was a double play on the word, but more on the ecological sense of the pioneer species, right? Because when the forest burns down, right, if we didn't plant the seeds, then there will be no new opportunities, new pathways. And I do not take for granted that even sowing those seeds will be enough, right? I think the tendency will be towards fascism and theocracy and other things that create, this fundamental feelings of security that is a fear, right? And I would say the other point when you were speaking with the tearing down the wall, we do still need to control how that wall falls, right? I mean, so if we don't somehow rein in the nukes that we have in our arsenals and the nuclear power plants and that kind of thing, and even the dams, right? If you know these, if we just collapse without planning, when those things finally break down, there's going to be a lot more lives
Yes.
lost and,
Yes.
and species lost and all of that than if we said, you know what, things are starting to fall apart now. Instead of just letting it go. I mean, we see great case studies with Soviet Union, right? I mean, the U.S. stepped in and tried to kind of secure their nuclear arsenal a little bit for them because they couldn't pay their soldiers and all that. And I hope somebody will pay for the U.S. to secure ours when we fall apart. But I don't know if there will be someone left.
Yeah. Anything that you would like to say to bring this conversation to completion? You read the questions that that I've been asking some guests. I don't want this to go too long. So anything that you want to offer that you didn't get a chance to, that you were prepared to discuss, or just anything that you'd like to say to feel complete in this conversation?
You asked me earlier about education in the future and how the pandemic changes that. I mean, I think it's funny when the first draft of that essay, and the essay you're referring to is the final chapter of State of the World 2017, Earth Education, and it's glimpses at what Earth education could look like in 2030, and the first draft was actually in 2040. Not sure why. I think maybe going 20 years in advance gave me more imaginative, creative opportunity. But as my colleague pointed out, when I was saying, well, but things are going to be so bad that this is just not going to be realistic. And I was like, yeah. He's like, don't write from that year, because it's just you're going to be talking about everybody's back out in the woods and learning basic skills again. And I was like, oh, okay, you're right. 2030 gives me a lot more freedom to kind of create imaginaries that are kind of relevant, right? So I felt like I could really draw out that what's stopping us from having schools organized around being in the forest all the time, right? And nothing is. I mean, we've shown that the forest school is quite something for elementary kids, and now they're extending outwards for older kids. But what's stopping us from having a marriage between at my most controversial, I married kind of controversial environmental technologies with moral education, right? Because it's one thing to talk about, nanotechnology or geoengineering or biotech or something without any parallel or embedded moral education, right? If we put the idea that this is about profit and strengthening corporate monopolies, whatever, then bioengineering is a horror. But is there a way that we can actually start thinking about embedding moral education with these inevitable conversations around technology, right? Whether that's appropriate technology or these controversial ones, right? So are there ways that we can really be more radical in thinking through what education looks like in a formal setting, right? It's easy to do any of this in a homeschool setting, let's say, but can you have a social entrepreneurial school other than just one organized in Thailand by this kind of amazing guy who did that? Can't this be a model that spreads across the world, right? So for me, I mean, that is part and parcel with this other big thinking around culture change, around kind of a Gaian-centric worldview, right? And there are institutions, and this goes back to your question of scaling up too. There are institutions that could be readily utilized when there's enough kind of basic energy here, right? I mean, the U.S., for good or for ill, we've allowed charter schools to kind of to take a space and take public money. There's nothing stopping us from creating a Gaian school other than the fact there probably aren't enough Gaians to run it yet or organize it yet, right? Or at least self-identify. But we can start kind of imagining ways that institution building can really help us get to an eco-centric future. So I think I would end on that point.
For more information about this project, go to postdoom.com.